They called her the archivist's ghost. She moved through the halls of the Northern Conclave with ink on her fingers and the weight of a dead man's work on her back, and the ranked members of the pack looked through her the way they looked through stone walls, registering the structure without acknowledging the substance. She had a desk no one visited, a title no one used, and a complaint ledger so thick with ignored filings it had to be bound with a second strap each winter. They said she talked to herself in the archive. They said she had no wolf to speak of. They said she was her father's ghost, which was the cruelest thing they said, because her father had been the only man in the Conclave's history who had ever made the system work the way it was written. And now there was a new Alpha King returned from the border war, scarred and silent, who did not yet know any of their names. He was about to learn hers. The year was 1147 of the Conclave's reckoning, and winter had not yet broken when Calder, king of the Northern Pack, rode under the iron gate of his own keep 3 days before Ledger Night. Lena heard the horns from the archive room, where she was rebinding a water-damaged volume of tithe records from the Conclave's 4th decade. The archive was the oldest room in the keep, cut from the same granite as the mountain it leaned against, and sound traveled strangely through its walls. She heard the horns as a low reverberation in the stone beneath her palms. She pressed one hand flat against the cracked clay hearth tile she had warmed her hands on since she was a child, following her father through these shelves, and she stayed where she was. King's arrivals were not her business. The tithe summary for the eastern border districts was her business, and it was due to the steward's office by midday. She finished rebinding the volume. She washed her hands in the cold basin by the door, dried them on the rough linen hanging beside it, and went to collect the summary from the flat oak press where it had been drying since dawn. Marit was waiting in the archive doorway, which was unusual. Marit was a retired keeper, one of the last 3 women who had worked alongside Lena's father during the years of his tenure, and she visited the archive often enough that Lena kept a low wooden chair for her near the hearth. She did not, as a rule, wait in doorways. "The king is in the hall," Maret said. She was a compact woman with gray-streaked hair pinned close and the habit of holding her elbows as though bracing against weather. "Vorn has already gone to him." Lena took the tithe summary from the press. "The summary is due to Vorn's office." "Vorn's office," Maret said, with the particular flatness she reserved for statements that required no elaboration. Lena understood. She tucked the summary under her arm and went out. The main hall of the Conclave Keep was 2 stories of gray stone fitted around a hearth wide enough to warm a war room, and it had been built to hold pack assemblies. It held one now, of a kind, a rough, informal crowd of ranked wolves who had gathered to see the returned king, and among them Vorn standing at the dais with the easy positioning of a man accustomed to occupying the center of a room. He was broad-shouldered and pale-haired, and wore the steward's chain as if it weighed nothing, which was how he wore every authority given to him. He had run the conclave for 2 years. He had learned to mistake that tenure for ownership. Calder stood at the far side of the dais and had not yet spoken. He was taller than the stories made him, which was the first thing Lena noticed, and the scar that ran from his left jaw to the base of his throat was the second. He wore travel clothes, no ceremonial chain, and the stillness of a man who had learned during a long war that patience was a sharper tool than noise. His eyes moved across the room in the steady, measured way of someone conducting an inventory. Lena did not cross to the dais. She found the steward's secretary, a thin young man named Corvin, and held out the tithe summary. "The Eastern District Report," she said, "for the steward's queue." Corvin had begun to reach for it when Vorn's voice cut across the hall. "The clerk has no standing to present this summary," Vorn said. He did not raise his voice. He had learned to pitch it to Carrie. "Send her back to her shelf." Lena kept her hand extended. She had heard the phrase before, in this room and others, and she had learned to let it pass through her the way cold wind passed through a badly hung shutter, present, but survivable. Corvin looked between her and the steward with the expression of a man watching two dogs determine which would snap first. "I'll take it." The voice was low and flat and came from the dais. Lena turned. Calder had crossed the floor without ceremony and was standing 3 feet from her, one hand extended, not to Corvin, but to her. She placed the tithe summary in his hand on instinct, because he was the king, and the summary was a document, and documents went where authority directed them. He did not look at the document immediately. He looked at her hands, which were ink-stained at the first and second knuckles as they always were, and then at her face, and then he said, "What is your name?" It was not precisely a question. It was the kind of statement that kings made when they wanted answers, and saw no reason to dress the wanting in courtesy. Lena met his gaze and held it, because her father had taught her to look at the person she addressed and to speak clearly. "Lena," she said, "record keeper and complaint clerk for the Conclave's administrative division." He said nothing for a moment. The room had gone quiet without anyone deciding to make it so. Then he turned and walked back to the dais with the tithe summary in his hand, and the crowd parted for him, and Vorn moved half a step to the side in a way that was not quite deference, but looked like it from a distance. Lena walked back across the hall toward the archive corridor. She told herself the warmth at the back of her neck was the hearth fire, which was closer to her than it had been in a year. She told herself that, and she almost believed it. The complaint that began the unraveling was not hers. It belonged to Pell, a young Omega healer in the Conclave's lower infirmary, whose formal rank had been stripped 3 weeks earlier by an administrative order from the steward's office. The order cited a procedural violation in the dispensing of wolfsbane tincture, a violation so minor and so technical that Lena had read it 4 times before she could articulate what Vorn had actually charged Pell with doing. Wolfsbane tincture, in measured doses, was the primary treatment for silver poison sickness. Pell had dispensed a double dose to a soldier whose wound was actively suppurating silver into his bloodstream. The order called this unauthorized excess. Lena called it medicine, and she understood exactly what Vorn was doing. He was stripping healers who might treat injuries he preferred to let fester. She filed the complaint on a gray morning 4 days after the king's return, recording it in the formal ledger with the careful precision her father had taught her. Each complaint required the clerk's seal, a date, and the name of the ranking official against whom it was lodged. She pressed the seal firmly. She wrote Vorn's name in the column marked Respondent, with the particular steadiness she maintained in her hand, regardless of what the rest of her was doing. Then she carried the ledger to the steward's correspondence office and left it with Corvin for routing. She knew it would not reach the correspondence queue. She had filed 63 complaints over the course of 2 years, each properly sealed, each properly dated, and not one had been entered into the master record. She had found the first voided file by accident, a month after her father died, when she was searching the lower archive for a missing tithe document, and instead found a bundled stack of unrouted complaints, bound with a cord and tucked behind the water cistern in the subfloor passage. She had recognized her own handwriting on the top sheet. She had filed them again, all 63, and noted the second filings in her private logbook with their dates. The logbook had been her father's. He had used it to track discrepancies in the tithe accounts in the months before Vorn's audit declared him a thief, and his handwriting was still legible in the early pages, small and precise and unafraid. She was in the archive 3 evenings after Pell's filing, recataloguing a set of historical land grants from the Conclave's 2nd century, when she heard a step in the corridor that was not Marette's. She knew Marette's step the way she knew the sound of the archive door on its hinges, a specific weight and rhythm, and this was heavier and slower. She did not look up from the land grant until the step stopped in the doorway. Calder filled the doorframe more than any person had a right to. He did not carry a candle. He had taken one of the hall sconces from the bracket near the archive entrance, which meant he had come down the corridor already knowing where the archive was. He looked at the room the way he had looked at the tithe summary in the hall, measuring rather than decorating, and then his gaze settled on her. "You filed a complaint," he said. "I file many complaints," she said. "It is my function." "Against the steward." "Against the steward on behalf of Pell, a healer in the lower infirmary whose rank was stripped by an order that does not survive procedural scrutiny. The grounds are in the filing." He came into the room without being invited and looked at the shelves. This close, in the low light of the single sconce, she could see the scar in detail she had not had in the hall, the way it had healed in two distinct phases, which meant the original cut had been treated and then opened again, and that the second time there had been no healer available. He stood at the shelf nearest to her and pulled a slim volume, looked at the spine, replaced it. His presence displaced the cold of the room in a way that she registered in her shoulders before she registered it in her mind. "How long have you kept this archive?" he said. "I have worked here since I was 15. My father was the master record keeper before me." He turned at that. She saw the recognition of the name in his face before he said it. "Daran." "Yes." A pause. He set the sconce on the edge of her work table, which put the light between them, and he looked at her across the grain of the old oak surface with an expression she could not categorize. His hands rested on the table edge. They were large hands with the particular scarring of a man who had used a sword in cold weather for decades, the knuckles thickened and rough. He did not reach toward her. The nearness of him, the warmth from his chest in the archive's perpetual chill, was present as a fact, and she was aware of it the way she was aware of the hearth tile beneath her, grounding rather than threatening, and she did not understand why. "Your father's audit," he said, 2 years ago, before the war called me north." "Vorn's audit," she said. "My father did not steal from the conclave. He documented a discrepancy in the tithe accounts and reported it to the steward's office. 6 weeks later, he was charged with embezzlement. He died in a servant's cell 3 months after his rank was stripped." She paused. "I have his logbooks. The original figures are in his hand." Calder held her gaze for what felt longer than it was. She made herself stay still under it. He said nothing, and the nothing was not dismissal. It was the silence of a man absorbing a weight he had not expected to be carrying when he walked through the archive door. Then he picked up the sconce and left, and she listened to his step recede down the corridor until the stones swallowed it. She stayed at the work table for a long moment, both hands flat on the oak surface, feeling her own heartbeat in her palms. She did not know what that silence meant. She told herself she did not need to. The next morning, Soren came to the archive, which had never happened before. He was a lean, careful man, Calder's second, with the quality of someone whose job was to notice what others missed, and he stood in the doorway with the posture of a person delivering instructions he was not sure would be welcome. "The king requests the logbooks," he said. "The ones you mentioned." Lena took her father's logbooks from the locked box beneath her work table. 2 slim volumes, the covers warped from the one time she had dropped them in a puddle, the pages dense with his small figures. She wrapped them in linen. She placed them in Soren's hands. "They are originals," she said. "I want them returned." Soren looked at the package with something careful in his face. "I'll see that they are," he said, and left. Teva passed her in the corridor half an hour later. Teva was the senior administrative clerk, 3 ranks above Lena in the keep's formal hierarchy, installed in that position by Vorn 2 years ago, when it had become clear that the previous occupant would not stop routing Lena's complaints to the proper queue. She had a way of positioning herself in narrow corridors so that whoever passed her had to acknowledge the narrowness. "You spoke to the king," Teva said. "I delivered a tithe summary," Lena said. "The king was present." You filed against the steward. It is my function. Teva looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has identified a mistake and is deciding whether to name it for the person's benefit or simply watch what follows. She chose, as she usually did, to name it. To name, "You'll file a complaint? Against the steward? With everything that man has spent 2 years building in that hall?" She lowered her voice, not from compassion, but from the instinct of someone who understood that some statements landed harder when quieted. "You're the archivist's ghost, girl. No one files on behalf of an archivist's ghost." Lena stepped around her. She said nothing. She had learned very early that the only reliable answer to a person who expected her to confirm her own smallness was to continue moving. That evening, she went to the subfloor passage where she had found the first bundle of voided complaints, and she found what she had suspected was there. Behind the water cistern, not one bundle now but 3, bound with the same cord in the same hand. She unwrapped them carefully in the passageway's cold, using the small candle she carried for exactly this purpose. She counted. 64 complaints, total, including Pell's most recent filing, each properly sealed. Each properly dated, each carrying her clerk's mark, which was legally the same as her sworn testimony that the complaint had been received and registered. She carried the bundles back to the archive. She refiled each one in the formal ledger that night, this time making a notation beside each entry in red ink. Previously routed, diverted, date of recovery. By the time she was done, the candle was a stub, and her hand ached from writing, and she pressed it flat against the warm clay of the hearth tile and breathed. Marette found her there near midnight, sitting on the floor beside the tile with the ledger across her knees, and said nothing, only went to the wooden chair by the hearth and sat in it, and the two of them stayed like that for a while in the good silence of women who had no use for pretending the world was other than it was. "Ledger night is in 2 days," Marit said at last. "I know," Lena said. Ledger night was the one night in the conclave's calendar year when the records hall was formally open to all ranked members of the pack for review of the previous year's administrative accounting. It was ancient law, older than the current keep, built into the conclave's founding charter as a check on exactly the kind of power Vorn had been quietly accumulating. On ledger night, the complaint ledger was presented to the assembly. On ledger night, the highest authority in residence was required by charter to formally receive it. On ledger night, Vorn could not bar her from the hall. She did not sleep much. Calder returned the logbooks the next evening, delivered by Soren with a small piece of folded paper tucked inside the linen wrapping. She opened the paper in the archive. It contained a single line in a hand she did not know, angular and dense. "Duran's figures hold." She sat with those 3 words for a long time. She heard, through Soren's presence at her door the following morning, a fragment of conversation from the corridor outside. Soren had come early, and he found her already at the catalog desk, and he told her, carefully, that the king had asked for the tithe records from the last 2 years of border transactions. She gave them to him. When Soren moved to leave, she heard, through the archive's particular acoustics, 2 voices in the outer corridor. One Calder's flat and measured, and another she recognized as belonging to Aldrich, the Eastern Pack elder who had arrived for ledger night the previous afternoon. "You are certain," Aldrich said, in a tone that was not quite doubt and not quite acceptance. "I am not certain of anything in this keep yet," Calder said. "But I have her father's logbooks, and the figures hold." She pulled the door half shut and went back to the catalog desk and sat, and the warmth that moved through her chest at that moment was something she permitted herself to feel and did not permit herself to name. She was at the archive door at the first bell of ledger night, the formal complaint ledger in her arms, the red ink notations visible on every page when opened. She had wrapped the ledger in the ceremonial cloth required by the Charter's presentation rules. Heavy dark wool with the conclave's doubled moon device worked in the border, and she carried it against her chest with both hands because it weighed 6 pounds and 2 months of her life. She had gone 4 steps into the corridor when Vorn's secretary stepped out of the shadow beside the archive entrance. He was not alone. 2 ranking wolves in conclave dress flanked him, and he held a document she recognized by its seal before she could read the text. The blood-binding suppression order, last invoked 119 years ago, which allowed a steward to revoke a clerk's standing in the event of administrative misconduct. She had found the mechanism referenced in the founding charter. She had not found it invoked in the historical record since the conclave's 3rd decade. "By order of the steward," Corvin said, and his voice was the voice of a person reading something he would rather not be reading. "The standing of the clerk Lena, record keeper and complaint filer for the administrative division, is hereby revoked, effective immediately and pending formal review, on the grounds of systematic procedural misrepresentation in the compilation of the formal complaint ledger." He held the document up. She could see Vorn's seal at the bottom, dark wax pressed hard. She stood. She did not step back. "The complaint ledger document 64 properly filed, properly sealed complaints," she said. "Systematically diverted from the routing queue by the steward's office. The notations are my sworn record of their recovery." "The standing," Corvin said, "is revoked. The complaint ledger filed by a person of no clerical standing carries no legal force under the charter." He paused. "You are not permitted in the hall." She looked at the document in his hand. She looked at the 2 wolves behind him, neither of whom met her gaze. She thought of her father's small, precise handwriting in the logbook's early pages. She thought of the cracked clay tile warm under her palm. She thought of 64 sealed pages and 2 months of midnight notations in red ink, and she thought of Pell in the lower infirmary, stripped of the standing that let her treat silver poison sickness. She walked past Corvin and into the hall. She heard him call after her. She heard his step follow, and then stop, because the hall was full, and she was already through the door, and the conclave's ranked members were already turning to see what had entered. The great hall of the keep was lit for ledger night the way it had been lit for a century, every torch in its bracket, every candle on the high tables, the hearth built high with split oak that threw light across the stone dais where the Alpha King's chair stood empty and the assembly waited. 47 wolves in conclave dress stood in the body of the hall. Aldrich from the Eastern Pack stood near the front with 2 of his delegation. Soren stood to one side of the dais, very still, watching her cross the floor. Vorn was already at the dais. He turned when she entered. She watched his expression move from satisfaction to something colder and more precise. "This woman," he said, pitching his voice to the hall, "has no wolf, no rank, and no standing." He let the words sit in the torchlight. "Her complaint is dust. She is dust." She stopped at the center of the hall, equidistant from the door and the dais. 47 faces turned toward her. 2 years. 64 complaints. 2 years of her father's ghost in a servant's cell while Vorn wore the steward's chain. 2 years of ink on her hands and a ledger no one read and a title no one used. She opened the ceremonial cloth. She held the ledger up. "I am Lena," she said, to the hall, not to Vorn. "Record keeper and complaint clerk for the Northern Conclave's administrative division, and daughter of Duran, who was master record keeper before me. I have no wolf and no rank, and, as of this evening, no standing. I have a formally compiled complaint ledger containing 64 entries, each sealed with the clerk's stamp, each carrying the date of original filing and the date of recovery from the steward's private diversion. I present it to this assembly under the Charter's ledger night provision, under which any member of the conclave may bring evidence of administrative misconduct before the highest authority in residence." The hall was very quiet. I am aware, she said, that I no longer hold the standing to present it formally. I am presenting it anyway. She heard the door at the back of the hall open. She felt it first in the change of air, the cold from the outer corridor cutting across the warmth of the torches, and then in the way the assembly shifted without anyone giving an order, the particular movement of wolves in a room when a dominant force enters. She did not turn. Vorn turned. The satisfaction was gone from his face. In its place was something she recognized as the expression of a man recalculating very quickly. The footsteps were unhurried. They crossed the floor with a weight that registered in the stone, and the assembly moved aside not from instruction, but from the instinct of bodies that understood the room had reorganized itself. She felt him before she saw him, the warmth at her back displacing the draft from the door, and then Calder was beside her. He did not look at Vorn. He looked at the ledger in her arms. He reached out and took hold of the near edge of it, not to take it. Just a hand on the binding, his fingers over hers for a moment in which the weight of the thing transferred between them. She let him take it. She let go. He carried it to the dais. He set it open on the presenting table beside the Alpha King's chair. He reached into the inner chest of his coat and removed an ink case, the small traveling kind, and uncapped it. Soren produced a quill from the table's writing stand without being asked. Calder took the quill, dipped it, and bent over the ledger. The scratch of the nib on the page was the only sound in the hall. He signed. He wrote more than a signature. She could see from where she stood that he was writing below the final complaint entry, a full line or two in the same angular hand she had seen on the piece of paper tucked into the return logbooks. He pressed the conclave seal ring, which he had not worn at arrival. She now understood he had gone to collect it before coming to the hall, pressed it into the ink block, and left the seal below the text. Then he straightened. He looked at her. The hall held its breath. "You are the only honest voice in this hall," he said. "That makes you mine to protect." In the silence that followed, Vorn said, "The king cannot ratify a complaint filed by a person of no standing. The charter is clear. The mechanism, Calder said, requires the highest authority to receive the ledger. I have received it. The mechanism also requires the authority to sign. I have signed it." He turned, fully, to look at Vorn for the first time since entering the hall. The charter does not require the filer to hold standing in order for the evidence to be valid. It requires the evidence to be presented. It was presented. To me, in this hall, on ledger night. He paused. By a woman who had no legal protection and walked in anyway. Aldrich, from the front of the assembly, said, "The complaint ledger. What does it show?" 64 filed complaints, Calder said. Systematically diverted from the routing queue by the steward's office. Alongside this, the logbooks of the master record keeper Duran, recovered from his daughter, which document a discrepancy in the border tithe accounts for the year 1145 of the conclave's reckoning. The discrepancy resolves, upon examination, into a systematic extraction of border tithe funds routed to accounts outside the conclave's formal treasury. He looked back at the assembly. Over a period of 2 years, the Northern Conclave's tithe revenues have been shorted by an amount I will present in full to the Eastern Pact's auditors, whose involvement I am requesting this evening. The silence in the hall had a different quality now. 47 wolves, and Aldrich's 2 delegates, and the particular stillness of people absorbing something that cannot be unfelt. Vorn said, "You have no proof that Your seal is on the suppression order served to my clerk tonight," Calder said. "Your name is in the respondent column of 64 complaints she filed in good faith and which you had diverted. And in the steward's locked correspondence drawer, where my second-in-command conducted an inventory at my request this afternoon." Soren, by the wall, inclined his head. "There are the original voided files, bundled with cord in your own hand's notation. Discard." Void. No action required. He stopped. You ran my keep for 2 years while I was at the border. I gave you that authority. You spent it on your own comfort and the silencing of every inconvenient voice in this hall. I am rescinding it. Vorn looked at the assembly. He looked at the door. He looked at the wolves flanking the dais who had not moved, who would not move, who understood as clearly as anyone in the room who was speaking and who was no longer. Tiva, Calder said. You will serve as interim administrative keeper pending the appointment of a permanent record keeper. You will report to my office tomorrow morning. He paused. Vorn. You will surrender the steward's chain and accompany Soren's guard to the holding room, where you will remain until the Eastern auditors are prepared to receive testimony. If you compel Soren to make that an instruction rather than a request, that will be noted in the audit record as well. Vorn looked finally at Lena. His expression had moved through recalculation and cold precision and arrived, she thought, at something simpler. The face of a man who understood that he had underestimated the thing he had spent 2 years stepping on, and that this understanding had come too late to be useful. He reached up and unclipped the steward's chain. He set it on the edge of the dais. Soren crossed the floor and Vorn went with him, and the assembly parted, and the door opened and closed, and he was gone. Aldrich looked at Lena across the torchlit floor. His expression was the expression of a man who has witnessed something he had not anticipated and is deciding what to do with the fact that his opinion had been wrong. The record-keeper's daughter, he said. He said it slowly, as if testing the weight of the phrase. The record-keeper, Calder said. He had moved off the dais and was standing at the edge of it, looking at Lena. The Northern Conclave's chief record-keeper, as of this evening, as I am designating it in the formal ledger, which I am signing tonight, under my seal. He looked at Aldrich. Any question about her standing? Aldrich was quiet for a moment. Then he said, None, and inclined his head, which was a significant motion from the elder of the Eastern Pack, and 2 of his delegates followed suit. One of the ranked wolves near the center of the assembly dropped to one knee, then another, then a third, and by the time the 4th descended, there was a quality in the room that was not noise, but was not silence either. Something that moved from chest to chest like the resonance of a struck bell. And she stood in the center of it and did not look away from Calder, because she thought if she moved her eyes from him, she might not remain upright. Marit had come in through the side entrance. Lena did not know when, but she was there now, beside the archive corridor door, her elbows held in both hands, her face carrying the expression of a woman who has waited a very long time for a particular account to be settled. Calder came down from the dais and crossed to her. He was unhurried. He had the logbooks in his other hand, the linen-wrapped volumes, and he held them out. She took them. Her hands were steady. Your father's record, he said. I am reinstating it. Formally tonight in the ledger, under my seal. The embezzlement finding against him will be marked as erroneous and based on falsified evidence. The notation will read that he reported a genuine discrepancy and was punished for it. He paused. He should have been protected. She held the logbooks against her chest. She had held things carefully all her life, documents and records and the truth of things, held them until the right moment. And she understood that this was a moment she was allowed to stop holding and to simply stand in. Thank you, she said. It was not adequate, but adequacy had never been the point of the archive, only accuracy. He stayed close, his hand still extended in the gesture of passing, and the ledger was on the dais between them and the hall was full, and she felt, for the first time in 2 years, that the space she occupied was sufficient. Not surplus, not ghost, sufficient. She looked at his face in the torchlight, at the scarred jaw and the heavy brow and the eyes that had done an inventory of the tithe summary before they ever did one of her, and she recognized, fully, a man who knew the weight of paperwork, Who understands what it costs to file truthfully against the people who control your access to every room? Who had stood at the back of a hall on ledger night and watched her walk in without standing and had not stopped her, because he had already understood what she was doing and had come to receive it. He had not come to rescue her. He had come to sign. The difference was the only difference that mattered. In the weeks that followed, the conclave's accounts were open to the Eastern auditors, and the figures Duran had noted in his logbooks resolved into a full accounting of the border tithe extraction that had funded Vaughan's private arrangements across 3 districts. 47 witnesses to ledger night gave testimony. Pell's rank as senior healer was restored in the first week, and she returned to the lower infirmary with the same steady hands and the same double doses for silver poison wounds, and no one filed a procedural objection. Teva, in her interim role, proved competent and considerably less interested in losing things once she understood the ledger was being read. The cracked clay tile was still warm the morning after. Lena pressed her palm to it before dawn, the archive quiet and her father's logbooks shelved in the position of honor she had kept open for them since the day she first understood they existed. Marette's chair was pulled close to the hearth. Calder's signature was visible in the complaint ledger on the desk, the ink dry and dark and settled into the page the way signatures settle when they are meant to last. She had work to do. There were 64 entries to formally close, each requiring a completion notation, each requiring the new steward's routing confirmation, each requiring the chief record keeper's final seal. She pulled the ledger close. She uncapped the ink. The archive smelled of old paper and cold stone and, faintly, the warmth of the tile. She pressed her hand to it one more time and then picked up her pen. She had always known the truth was in the figures. She had known it since she was 15, following her father through these shelves, learning to read the difference between an honest error and a deliberate one. The difference was always there, in the spacing, in the handwriting, in the particular way numbers lied when they were written by someone who knew they were lying. Her father had known it. He had written it down. She had carried it. And the one man in the conclave with the authority to act on it had walked into the hall and done exactly that, and put his name in the book. And here was the book, open on her desk, carrying both their names now. She was not a ghost. She had never been a ghost. She had been the record.